Hello and welcome to this presentation titled 9/11 Coincidence Theory. This is a critical examination of the official story surrounding what would become the foundational event for the new American century. You're probably wondering what the new American century is. Well, we'll cover that in just a bit here. First of all, there's a few things that you want to ask yourself before we get into this information. The first question would be, am I so loyal to a political party that it will affect my likelihood of acknowledging the factual information in this presentation? There are a couple questions I'd like you to ask yourself. For those of you who consider yourself Democrats or progressives, number one, will I be willing to accept any information that points to Republicans as criminals at face value without examining its validity? Or in other words, do you come in wanting to believe that this administration dropped the ball, or even worse, regarding September 11th? Do you have a predisposition to that viewpoint? Second question is, will I be willing to follow the information to its conclusions, even if it points to people that I previously respected and agreed with as being criminally negligent or complicit? And the reason I put that question in there is because it's impossible to get to the bottom of what happened on 9/11 if we just limit our scope of the people and organizations we look at to those people who are our ideological enemies. And as we'll see, it does go deeper and farther back than just the Bush administration. Now, if you are a Republican, I have a couple questions that I would like for you to ask yourself. These are questions I had to grapple with myself, and eventually I believe I answered these questions in the right way. The first one is, do I value constitutional and conservative principles higher than party loyalty? The second question is, do I automatically assume that anyone who would criticize the Bush administration must be a left-wing liberal? Now, there are many types of people who dispute or disbelieve the official count of 9/11. They're a wide cross-section of society, and it's not a homogeneous group. We have conservative constitutionalists or patriots, people in the patriot movement. In fact, they've been on the cutting edge of the 9/11 truth movement right from day one. Individuals like Alex Jones and other patriots have suspected that the official account was untrue really since day one, and even sooner. In fact, if you do a Google video, type in the search terms Alex Warns, you can find a short clip there from Alex Jones' television show where 2 months before 9/11 he actually predicts a massive terror attack, and he speculates that it would have to do with planes and possibly the World Trade Center, and that they would most likely blame it on bin Laden. So anyway, my point with all of that is to show that this is not some movement that came out of Europe or out of the Democratic underground, as many on the right wing try to claim. But we also do have many Democrats, liberals, and progressives who also disbelieve the official account. We have political moderates. We have people who were previously completely uninvolved and undecided politically. And in addition, we have many credible and qualified public figures and experts who have gone on record disputing the official account. And we're going to meet some of them here. We have Representative Kurt Weldon of Pennsylvania. He is Vice Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and he said, referring to the 9/11 Commission, quote, "There's something very sinister going on here that really troubles me." Weldon told this to Fox News, blasting the September 11th Commission for not taking the claims more seriously. He also said some panel members were trying to smear Schaefer and Abel Danger. Now, Abel Danger was a military operation that Weldon looked into, and much of the information we have about it is thanks to his efforts. And if you'll notice, he is recently being attacked, and in what I believe to be a coordinated attack from the administration in retaliation to these investigations, because he did butt heads with the Bush administration in trying to follow up on the information surrounding Able Danger. And Able Danger was a program that apparently involved many of the hijackers as double agents, but anyway, Weldon has effectively said regarding the September 11th Commission, he said there's something very sinister going on, and then he says, what has the September 11th Commission got to hide? That's from Fox News, August 28th of 2005. We have former Senator Max Cleland, who is a former administrator of the U.S. Veterans Administration, captain of the U.S. Army in Vietnam, and he was also a former member of the 9/11 Commission. And he has said, if this decision stands to limit access to White House documents, I, as a member of the Commission, cannot look any American in the eye, especially family members of the victims, and say the Commission had full access. This investigation is now compromised. We have Edward L. Peck, Deputy Director of the White House Task Force on Terrorism under Ronald Reagan, and he has joined as a signatory on a petition, a nationwide petition, which says, we want truthful answers to questions. As Americans of conscience, we ask for four things: an immediate investigation by New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer, immediate investigation in congressional hearings, immediate attention to scrutinize and investigate the evidence, the formation of a truly independent citizens-based inquiry. And that is the petition that Edward L. Peck has put his signature on. So he is obviously very concerned about the official account and the lack of information or factual information that we're getting with regard to 9/11. Let's look at the statement of Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, yet another conservative former Reagan official. He was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under Reagan, very conservative, and he has said, quote, we know that it is strictly impossible for any building, much less steel-columned buildings, to pancake at free fall speed. Therefore, it is a non-controversial fact that the official explanation of the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings is false. He also said there are not many editors eager for writers to explore the glaring defects of the 9/11 Commission report. One would think that if the report could stand analysis, there would not be a taboo against calling attention to the inadequacy of its explanations. We have Catherine Austin Fitts, Assistant Secretary of Housing under George H.W. Bush, former Managing Director of Dillon Read and Company, and she has said, quote, the official story could not possibly have happened. It's not possible. It's not operationally feasible. The commission was a whitewash. And then she has also signed that petition that we spoke about earlier. Here we have a statement from Daniel Ellsberg, former military analyst for the RAND Corporation, most well known for leaking the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1971. And he has said regarding 9/11, quote, there is no question in my mind that there is enough evidence to justify a very comprehensive and hard-hitting investigation of the kind we have not seen, with subpoenas, general questioning of people, releasing a lot of documents. There's no question that very serious questions have been raised about how much they knew beforehand and how much involvement there may have been. And he said that on a radio interview in July of 2006. Here we also have Philip J. Berg, Esquire. He's a former Deputy Attorney General for the state of Pennsylvania. And he said, quote, the official story of what actually took place on 9/11 is a lie. And he has also signed that petition, that nationwide petition calling for a new investigation. Now let's look at the statement of William Christensen. He is a 28-year CIA analyst. He's now retired, but he was a CIA analyst for 28 years, director of the CIA's Office of Regional and Political Analysis. And here's what he has said just recently. After spending the better part of the last 5 years treating these alternative 9/11 theories with utmost skepticism, I have devoted serious time to actually studying them in recent months, and have also carefully watched several videos that are available on the subject. I've come to believe that significant parts of the 9/11 theories are true, and that therefore significant parts of the official story put out by the U.S. government and the 9/11 Commission are false. And he also said, I now think there is persuasive evidence that the events of September 11th did not unfold as the Bush administration and the 9/11 Commission would have us believe. And we have Colonel Robert Bowman, Ph.D., U.S. Air Force, retired. He was the director of the Advanced Space Programs Development under Presidents Ford and Carter, U.S. Air Force fighter pilot with over 100 combat missions. And he also flew missions as an interceptor pilot, which gives him directly relevant expertise to what happened on 9/11. And he has a Ph.D. in aeronautics and nuclear engineering. And he has said, regarding 9/11, quote, a lot of these pieces of information taken together prove that the official story, the official conspiracy theory of 9/11 is a bunch of hogwash. It's impossible. I think the very kindest thing that we can say about George W. Bush and all the people in the U.S. government that have been involved in this massive cover-up is that they were aware of impending attacks and let them happen. That is high treason and conspiracy to commit murder. So some pretty strong words there. Now, the reason I show you all of these quotes is to kind of give you some background and break down this idea that somehow only kooks on the internet believe this type of thing. We have some very highly credentialed, highly credible people who have made some very strong and very public statements about this. And the first thing you're probably wondering is, why haven't I heard about any of this? Well, that's a good question, because until the last few months, the 9/11 truth movement has literally not been covered hardly at all by the mainstream media, and just in the last few months it's gotten so big that they've had to cover it, but they kind of do it in a manner that, well, really trivializes it. But the funny thing is, if it was really so trivial, they wouldn't be covering it as they didn't for a long time. Okay, so of all the people who look at this information, almost all come away with a few things. And they don't agree on everything. And, the 9/11 truth movement is not a homogenous community. There's a lot of disagreement. But here are some of the things that just about everybody does have in common. Number one, an awareness of the grave threat to the Constitution and the American way of life. Now, I've seen, professors like Dr. Barrett and Jim Fetzer, who are kind of left-leaning professors, or they have been traditionally, and they still are in a lot of ways, but I'm hearing these guys talk about the Constitution and protecting it, and it's not just lip service. They really are aware of the threat to our basic American system. And so in that way, I think that this is a movement that cuts across party and ideology. And number two, we almost all come away with an understanding of the way that our media has been manipulative and complicit in the cover-up of this information. And number three, a renewed commitment to hold our elected officials accountable to the law and basic moral principles. And most importantly, a strong desire to do something. So before we launch into the real meat of the information and evidence here, there are a couple of things I want to get out of the way. And these are things that tend to be debate killers, logic killers, tactics that are used to avoid a real substantive discussion of these issues. What is conspiracy theory? Well, according to Webster's Online Dictionary, a conspiracy is a secret agreement between two or more people to perform an unlawful act, a plot to carry out some harmful or illegal act, or a group of conspirators banded together to achieve some harmful or illegal purpose. Or in other words, the members, the individuals involved in a conspiracy. So that's your definition. A conspiracy theory, then, would be a hypothesis or explanation of observed facts or events which relies on conspiracy as the explanation. Although it is a perfectly legitimate logical exercise when observing coordinated events, the term conspiracy theory has been stigmatized in popular culture and therefore has a sensationalist effect when used. Those who refer to people who question the official story of events as conspiracy theorists use this terminology for its sensational effect, to stigmatize and discredit the individual and avoid logically addressing the facts. When we're faced with observations of facts or events that appear to be coordinated, there are two approaches to explain them. Now, conspiracy theory, as we've already seen, is the idea that the apparent parallels of chance are a result of coordination, or the idea that when you see multiple things working together to bring something to happen, that you just logically think that there must be some force or some coordinated effort behind those events. Or coincidence theory is the idea that those apparent parallels are a result of pure chance. The problem with coincidence theory is that because it relies on chance, it becomes less likely to correspond with reality each time it is employed to explain corresponding events. In certain situations, conspiracy theory is obviously the more logical choice, given the probabilities. For example, the official explanation of 9/11 is a conspiracy theory, by definition. It begins with the presumption that a conspiracy, or a group of two or more individuals, in this case bin Laden and the 19 hijackers, must have been responsible. This is a perfectly logical exercise, since it would be preposterous to assume that all the impacts at all three buildings within the space of 2 hours were pure coincidence, or in other words, that they were accidental crashes. Everybody who was paying attention when the events of September 11th were unfolding, the minute we saw that second plane hit that tower, everybody knew that it was a coordinated attack and that it was no longer just an accidental occurrence. That was a possibility with the first plane hitting. Well, the minute you saw that second plane hit the tower and you assumed that it was an attack, guess what? You were a conspiracy theorist. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's logical. It would have been ridiculous to assume that two planes happened to crash into those two towers and then the Pentagon just by pure chance. Unfortunately, the official story, after using conspiracy theory to explain the coordination of the hijackings themselves, relies heavily on coincidence theory to explain a host of other observed facts regarding 9/11. Now keep in mind that coincidence can be perfectly plausible to explain isolated events, but when you continue to rely on it to explain more and more observations of a particular event or series of events, its plausibility goes down because of the laws of probability. The official story relies upon coincidence theory. It does this in two primary ways. Number one, by specifically attributing certain observations which were integral to the success of the attacks to coincidence, or to coincidental and unfortunate incompetence. Or number two, as is far more common, it uses conspiracy theory or coincidence theory by simply not addressing certain observations at all, and thereby implying that they are the result of chance occurrence and are not relevant or worthy of scrutiny. Let's look at some areas of facts where coincidence theory is relied upon by the official explanation. One big area of these facts is the sudden global and symmetrical collapses of 3 steel high-rise buildings at the World Trade Center due, purportedly, to localized asymmetrical damage and fires. Now keep in mind that no steel frame high-rise building has ever experienced global collapse due to structural weakening from fire, which is what the official story attributes those collapses to. And this has never happened before nor since 9/11, and yet we're told to believe in the coincidence theory that this happened 3 times in one day on 9/11. Another area of coincidence theory is the multiple military air defense drills simulating hijacking of planes and building impacts which facilitated the 9/11 attacks both by confusing and diverting air defenses. Now, these drills were being conducted on the morning of September 11th during the actual time when the attacks were occurring, and they very much enabled those attacks to be successful. We also have the multiple intelligence failures, which facilitated the attacks, and specific prior knowledge regarding the attacks. And then we also have the history and nature of the individuals designated as Al-Qaeda and their connections to the CIA, MI6, and Pakistan's ISI, as well as the strategic use of these operatives by Western intelligence agencies in several global conflicts as recently as Bosnia. We also have the statements of motive prior to 9/11 by individuals and policy groups, many of whom are now the key architects of U.S. foreign and domestic policy. We also have the widespread political opportunism surrounding 9/11 and efforts to implement long-standing foreign and domestic policies and strategies based on 9/11 and the threat of Islamic terrorism. Now, in each of these cases alone, coincidence would be an improbable explanation. When considered in totality, it is so astronomically unlikely as to be practically impossible. We will examine some of these areas in detail, but by no means exhaustively. Please do your own research. And to that end, I have a website located at www.utah911truth.com, and I have a lot of information on there, but I link to a great deal more information, and I tried to link to just the best sources of information, places that don't engage in speculation, and I also have links to a lot of the good 9/11 documentaries and a lot of the really substantive presentations by people like Dr. Stephen Jones and Kevin Ryan. Well, we'll talk a little more about their information later, but Utah911truth.com is a great resource for the information I have there, but even more so for being able to link to good sources of information. Another thing we need to get out of the way before proceeding is the issue of the burden of proof. One thing I find when I talk to people about 9/11, they always want to know, okay, well, if what we've been told isn't true, then who did it and how did they do it? And they want names, they want all the details. Well, if anyone comes to you claiming to have all the details and of exactly who did it and how it was done, don't trust that person, because the fact is there is a lot we don't know. I'm going to tell you what we do know, and I think it paints a pretty definitive picture of what happened. One thing we do know for a fact, the official story is untrue. But anyway, regarding the burden of proof, the thing we have to keep in mind is the burden of proof regarding September 11th is on the shoulders of those who have given us an account of events, just as in a criminal trial. Now, if you went into a criminal trial, and let's say you have a prosecutor and you have a defendant who is accused of the crime of conspiracy, well, it is that prosecutor's burden to prove his account of events, or to prove that the defendant is guilty. The prosecutor doesn't have the luxury of being able to put forth a case that doesn't stand up to the facts, as has been done with regard to 9/11. He doesn't have the luxury of being able to put that case up, and then when the defendant challenges his case, to turn and say, well, okay, if the defendant didn't do it, then who did, and prove it to me. That's not how it works. The burden of proof is on those who have given us the account. The Bush administration and the Justice Department gave us an explanation of the events that bin Laden and 19 fanatical Muslims were independently responsible for the 9/11 attacks. They then asked us to completely change all of our domestic and foreign policy based on this explanation. So given the way that 9/11 has reoriented our society, reoriented all of our governmental priorities, our budgetary priorities, foreign policy, this is the linchpin for everything about what our government is doing right now. And so given that, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect a standard of proof here with regard to the official story. Have our public officials met this burden? Have they even attempted to? Consider the following statement. The FBI has no hard evidence connecting Osama bin Laden to the 9/11 attacks. Now, this statement was made by a man named Rex Toom. He is the chief of investigative publicity for the FBI, and he made this official statement on the record when he was asked by a reporter why Osama bin Laden's wanted poster on the FBI's website did not include the 9/11 attacks among the things that he's wanted for. And it still doesn't to this day. You can see this on your screen, and you can go to the FBI's website and look this up. Anyway, this was his statement. They are officially on record saying they have no hard evidence linking bin Laden to 9/11. That's a staggering admission. So what does this mean? Well, the Bush administration and agencies under its control were apparently so busy acting on their explanation of the events of September 11th that they could not be bothered to substantiate it. It also means that the Democrats were either fine with this, or they were so afraid of appearing unpatriotic that they did not demand evidence before authorizing wars based on this explanation. There are only two possibilities here, and either one should make you angry. Either you are not important enough or intelligent enough for these officials who we elect to serve us to take the time to show you evidence, or they are hiding something. Now, one could argue that maybe they had evidence that we didn't have access to because of the sensitive nature of it. And my argument would be, well, okay, but it's been over 5 years now. You know, where's the evidence? And besides, that still doesn't explain that the FBI admits they have no hard evidence. They're on record saying they have no hard evidence, not just that they don't have evidence that they can show us, but that they don't have it. So that's a huge problem to me. Here are a few questions to ask yourself and keep in mind during this presentation. Number one, why do I believe that Osama bin Laden and 19 Islamic radicals were independently responsible for 9/11? Have I been shown evidence for this assertion? Is my belief in this assertion a result of a logical, empirical process? So is there any reason that I should doubt the official explanation of 9/11? You should doubt the official story because, one, it is in direct conflict with many of the observed facts. Number two, the official story relies heavily on coincidence in explaining multiple facts, making it inherently dubious. Three, certain aspects of the official story have been revised multiple times since 9/11. Four, the official story does not explain or attempt to explain many of the observed facts and events. And five, the official story or the 9/11 Commission report was formulated by those without either the incentive or disposition to be objective, honest, or exhaustive. Okay, so let's look at that first area of facts that the official narrative is in direct conflict with or fails to explain. Number one, the destruction of the World Trade Center. First of all, we have to establish what is the official explanation of the collapses of World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7. There have actually been at least 4 accounts for the collapses of the Twin Towers that have been at one point or for certain purposes considered the official explanation. These are number 1, the initial FEMA report, number 2, the Silverstein-Weidlinger report. Now this report was a report undertaken by the leaseholder of the buildings, Larry Silverstein, and it was undertaken through private contractors in support of his insurance claim. He had a $3.5 billion insurance claim, and he actually claimed the 2 towers as separate events, so his claim ended up being a $7 billion insurance claim, and he undertook this report in support of that. And interestingly enough, it came to some very different conclusions from what the other reports came to. And there are probably some things that we could assume about why those conclusions were different. There is also the findings of the 9/11 Commission, which did deal with the collapses to an extent. And this is the origin of what we call the pancake effect, or the idea that the floors kind of pancaked as the trusses failed. The floors are pancaked from one to another, and this gradual momentum of all these floors pancaking is what caused the global collapse. And that comes from the 9/11 Commission report. And then the most recently, we have the 2005 NIST report. The NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they are a government agency. We need to get that out in the open, up right away. They report through Carlos Gutierrez, through the Department of Commerce. And as such, I would argue they have very little incentive to do an objective examination of the evidence here, seeing as how the supervisors that they report to are already relying on a certain version of events. So they have very little incentive to upset that or look at anything that would contradict that. So those are your 4 accounts so far. Maybe there will be more, who knows. But the important thing to remember about these 4 accounts is, although they don't differ in every respect, they do differ substantially in the explanations for the collapses, enough that they are all mutually exclusive. They can't all be true, and that's important to recognize. Many people discussing the collapses of the buildings on both sides of the 9/11 debate are still caught up in discussions based on these earlier reports, creating a great deal of misunderstanding. We will deal only with the most recent and most widely accepted hypothesis, which is the one issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in 2005, the NIST report. So let's look at exactly what the NIST explanation for the collapses says. Quote, NIST's hypothesis is that the towers collapsed ultimately due to the fires they suffered. As the fires burned, the building's steel core columns buckled and shortened. This shifted more load to the building's perimeter columns, which were already affected by the heat of the fires, and caused them to give way under the increased stress. It is important to note that NIST's theory is, quote, essentially a fire theory. That's going to be a key factor here. And it relies on the combination of fire and the increased stress from the weight of the floors above the impact zones, which in this case were 12 and 28 floors, depending on the tower, to initiate that collapse. Now, let's look at some of the things that the NIST report does not do. Number 1, the NIST report does not claim that jet fuel melted steel, but only that the fires weakened the steel enough to initiate collapse under the stress from 12 and 28 floors. So there's a lot of people running around talking about how jet fuel can't melt steel. Well, that's pretty much a given by everybody. It was only some of the initial scientists in the most very initial reports that claimed that the jet fuel had melted the steel. But all of the serious work that has been done with regard to these collapses on both sides acknowledges that the jet fuel could not have melted the steel, but they simply maintain that it weakened the steel enough to cause collapse. And that's important to set the record straight on that, so that we're not caught up arguing something that nobody is maintaining. NIST report also makes no mention of molten metal found at the collapse site in the weeks and months after 9/11, and as described in numerous reports. So the fact that they don't claim that the jet fuel melted the steel is a big problem for them, because then how do they explain this molten metal that was found at the base of each of the towers and also at the base of Building 7? Dr. Jones has a hypothesis that does explain that, and if you want to get into that in more detail, I'm going to tell you here shortly where you can find some information on his hypothesis, but I'm not going to address it here in detail. The NIST report only attempts to explain the events which lead to collapse initiation. They offer no explanation as to why the collapses were global, or that why, once that collapse was initiated, as they claim, why it would have continued into a global, complete collapse instead of being just maybe a partial or a symmetrical collapse, with part of the building falling down, but not all of it. They don't even attempt to address why that is the case. They only deal with the factors leading up to what they call collapse initiation. And the other very important thing that the NIST report does not do is it does not even attempt to explain the collapse of World Trade Center Building Number 7. They did make some initial speculations as to why that may have come down, but they have not explained it. In fact, we're going to look at that a little later here. They hope to be able to explain it sometime in 2007, but they've had some trouble doing that. In 1975, history performed for us an experiment that was directly relevant to NIST's hypothesis in several ways. On February 13, 1975, the World Trade Center North Tower was beset by a fire, which, quote, burned at temperatures in excess of 700 degrees Celsius for over 3 hours and spread over some 65% of the 11th floor, including the core, and it caused no serious structural damage to the steel structure. In particular, no trusses needed to be replaced. And that is from the New York Times, February 15th, 1975. So how is this 1975 fire relevant to 9/11? It's relevant because the main factors to which NIST attributes, quote, collapse initiation were present in this incident, which did not result in even a partial collapse or even damage to the steel that would require replacement. We had fires of 1275 degrees Fahrenheit or 700 Celsius, which would be comparable to the most favorable estimates of temperature to the official story, and which are well in excess of the temperatures which NIST itself found evidence for, and also well in excess of the likely temperatures according to Kevin Ryan's thermodynamic calculations, which estimated a maximum temperature on 9/11 in the towers of about 600 Fahrenheit. Okay, so if his calculation is correct, that would put these fires on 9/11 as actually being much lower in temperature than the 1975 fire. And that is also consistent with the temperatures that NIST, the highest temperatures that they found actual evidence for in steel. The other critical factor that we have present in the 1975 fire is a whopping 99 floors of weight above the affected area, as opposed to 12 and 28 floors on 9/11. So this fire occurred at the 11th floor, and it burned, from everything we can tell, at much higher temperature. It enveloped the core, and here we have 99 floors of weight above the affected area, providing stress on the affected columns and members, and we don't have even a partial collapse. And yet we're expected to believe that on September 11th, that global collapse was caused by 12 and 28 floors of weight above the affected area. So that is a big problem for NIST's hypothesis. What does this mean about NIST's hypothesis? Well, since NIST's hypothesis relies primarily on the combination of weakening of the steel due to fire and not the impact of the aircraft, and the weight of 12 and 28 floors, then a similar collapse should have been observed in 1975 under the weight of 99 floors and fires that burned for twice as long or 3 times as long, depending on which tower you're talking about. Even if the damage to the outer structure from the impacts makes the key difference in initiating collapse, which is not what NIST claims, but even if you believe that to be the case, the shortening of the steel core that NIST attributes to fires alone should still have been observed in the 1975 fire, but it was not. And what about Building 7? At approximately 5:30 p.m. on the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, World Trade Center Building Number 7, a 47-story high-rise steel building, collapsed. It was never hit by a plane, though it had localized fire and damage at the bottom of the south side of the building. This was pretty minor damage, but there was damage from the falling of the debris of the 2 towers. Also, Building 7 had an asymmetrical support structure, which further decreases the possibility of seeing a symmetrical collapse like the one we saw, and the asymmetrical nature of the damage being just on the very bottom south side, you would also expect then to see maybe a tipping over towards that side, some sort of asymmetrical collapse, but not a straight down collapse like the one we saw. Now, Building 7 collapsed in a perfect symmetrical fashion at near free fall speed into its own footprint. Those are all key attributes of controlled demolition. In fact, they're the goals of controlled demolition. Now, what explanation of Building 7's collapse have we been given? The 9/11 Commission completely disregarded the collapse of Building 7. completely ignored it. The NIST report, while it made some initial speculations, has not attempted to explain this collapse. Let's look at this statement from the head of the NIST investigation, a man named Dr. Shyam Sunder, and he was speaking to the New Yorker magazine on March 20th of 2006. And he said, "Truthfully, I don't really know. We've had trouble getting a handle on building number 7. I would submit that they are having trouble getting a handle on it because they are restricted to the hypotheses that are consistent with the official story. In other words, they're a government agency, the people they're reporting to that are signing their paychecks are already relying on the official narrative. They're already relying on a certain account of events. So in NIST, in doing their investigation, they're just restricted by virtue of that. They're not going to come up with anything or look at anything that varies from that. If you substitute the hypothesis of controlled demolition, there's no difficulty in getting a handle on it at all, because all the data is consistent with it. So is there a hypothesis that does account for the observed facts? All 3 World Trade Center collapses exhibited 11 telltale characteristics that would have been expected if and only if these were examples of controlled demolition. Since these characteristics had only been observed previously in cases of controlled demolition, then the most logical hypothesis to begin with would have been controlled demolition. Now, several of the live television reports on September 11th reflected this logical assumption. One in particular I remember was the live coverage on CNBC, which is an NBC-owned cable network that covers the financial markets. I was watching this at the very time, and I remember seeing this exact footage live. I did manage to dig up the video clip, but because it's on YouTube, I wasn't able to include the video of it in the presentation. It's so low quality and it's hard to extract the video into the right format.
This was clearly, the way the structure is collapsing, this was the result of something that was planned. This is not, it's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know.
And in addition to that last clip, there's also a famous clip of the live footage of Building 7 collapsing where Dan Rather comments that it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. So this was definitely a natural, instinctive response that many people had at the time. None of the official explanations, however, despite this, has even attempted to explain most of these characteristics of controlled demolition. Here are 11 telltale characteristics of controlled demolition. I'm just going to list them here. I'm not going to go into detail, but these come from Dr. David Ray Griffin's paper, The Destruction of the World Trade Center, Why the Official Account Cannot Be True. Put that into a Google search, you'll come up with his paper, and it's a very good read about these characteristics of controlled demolition. Each of the 3 collapses exhibited all of these characteristics, and they are: number 1, sudden onset; 2, symmetrical collapse, or in other words, straight down evenly; number 3, near free fall speed; number 4, total collapse as opposed to partial or localized collapse; number 5, sliced steel; number 6, pulverization of concrete; number 7, pyroclastic dust clouds. These are a particular type of dust clouds, as you see in the picture here, that are typically only associated with highly explosive chemical reactions. We see these are very common with volcanic reactions. They look very similar. And gravity alone could not provide nearly the kinetic energy required to create this pyroclastic clouds. Horizontal ejections. You see steel beams being ejected horizontally outwards, and in some cases getting embedded into nearby buildings 500 feet away. Gravity could not provide the energy to do that. We have demolition rings, these flashes of demolitions going around the floors that many of the witnesses reported seeing. And we also have number 10, eyewitness testimony of explosions. There is just a mountain of eyewitness testimony of explosions going off, and in some cases long after the initial impacts, and in some cases even down in the basement, which is the testimony of William Rodriguez. He was the janitor and the last person pulled from the rubble, and he talked about explosions happening in the sub-basement, and which is consistent with a controlled demolition, because in a controlled demolition they would have had to blow the core at the base. So his testimony is very important. And then we also have 11, the characteristic of molten metal. NIST's hypothesis cannot account for these pools of molten metal that were observed at the base of not only the two towers where the planes hit, but also Building 7. And Dr. Jones' hypothesis does account for that. Okay, so that's all I'm going to cover, but for further information on controlled demolition, I'm going to point you to the work of Dr. Stephen E. Jones. He's at the physics department of BYU, or he was. He recently retired, largely because of the controversy surrounding this work. And Kevin Ryan, who is a chemist. He was a former manager at Underwriters Laboratories, which is a company which was involved with NIST's report. They did some of the testing for some of the steel models, and Kevin Ryan was a manager there, and he was in close contact with the people working on those models, and he was fired for raising questions about their findings and pointing out some of these problems with and inconsistencies with the official story, and even the observations that UL was finding in these model tests were not consistent with what NIST was claiming. And he wrote a letter, brought that up, he went public, and he was fired as a result. So, but both of these experts, as well as Jim Hoffman, who is a software engineer and a mathematics and polymer chemistry expert. He's written software simulations having to do with engineering and polymer chemistry. His website is WTC7.net, and there's a lot of good information there about the collapses and controlled demolition. Also, for further information on controlled demolition, there are two very good documentaries that have come out recently. One is called Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic, and you can find more information on this at www.911truth.org, and the video is also available on Google Video. If you type in a search, it's up there for free. And 9/11 Mysteries Part 1, Demolitions, that is also available on Google Video and or for sale, the DVD at Infowars.com. Okay, let's look at the second area of observed facts that the official narrative is in direct conflict with or fails to explain. This would be 9/11 air defenses, drills, confusion, and contradiction. So where were the air defenses on September 11th? There are some major problems with the response of our air defenses. Number one, standing protocols that would have prevented the attacks were not followed. Number two, at least 6 separate drills or war game scenarios were being run on the morning of September 11th during the time of the attacks. These drills included the insertion of fake radar inputs and had the effect of confusing and distracting first responders, as well as diverting available aircraft away from the area. Number three, the Pentagon has changed their account several times and was actually suspected by the 9/11 Commission of falsifying and withholding information, even to the extent that the 9/11 Commission considered criminal charges. And number four, what were the orders spoken of by Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta in his testimony before the 9/11 Commission? Okay, let's look at the intercept protocols. Remember that intercept does not necessarily mean to shoot down. Intercept protocols involve a series of graduated response steps, with the shoot down being the last resort. But up until 2 months before 9/11, it was always within the power of generals in place, felt necessary. They did have that authority to order a shoot down. It is standard operating procedure to scramble jet fighters for any one of the following situations. Number one, an aircraft goes off course. Number two, radio contact with it is lost. Or number three, the transponder is turned off. On 9/11, the 4 hijacked aircraft met not just one, but all 3 of these criteria. Between September 2000 and June 2001, interceptors were scrambled 67 times. In the year 2000 alone, jets were scrambled 129 times. The Air Defense Network had, on September 11th, predictable and effective procedures for dealing with just such an attack, yet it failed to respond in a timely manner until after the attack was over, more than an hour and a half after it had started. Why were these protocols not followed to prevent the attacks? Well, let's look at some of the reasons why. One big reason why the attacks were not prevented by our air defenses, the confusion from at least 6 separate drills or war games being run at the time of the attacks, which simulated hijackings of planes as well as planes impacting into buildings. And then we also have possible stand-down orders. Let's look at these war game drills first. The first drill that we know was being run on September 11th during the time of the attacks was a CIA National Reconnaissance Office exercise, and this involved a simulation of a plane crash into the NRO headquarters near Dulles Airport, Virginia. This was not a terrorism exercise, but it did result in the evacuation of most NRO employees just as the real 9/11 was taking place. So what was the effect of this drill? Well, it made it more difficult for the nation's spy satellites to be used to track the hijacked planes. And this was reported by the Associated Press October 21st of 2002. The next drill that we had going on the morning of 9/11 was called Vigilant Guardian. Now this drill simulated very closely the hijackings of 9/11, and the effects of this drill were that top NORAD personnel were confused. They were not sure if the 9/11 hijackings were, quote, real world or exercise. And this was reported by Aviation Week in Space Technology on June 3rd of 2002. Drill number 3, Northern Vigilance. Now this drill was planned months in advance. It involved deploying fighter jets to locations in Alaska and northern Canada. The effects of this drill were that it ensured there would be fewer fighter planes available to protect the East Coast on 9/11. Confusion from simulated information fed into radar screens was also a result of this drill. In other words, because of the drills going on, the people at NORAD, and you can hear this borne out by the tapes that were recently released and covered by Vanity Fair, and you hear the people saying, I think this is an input, or they'll be saying, I've never seen so much real world during an exercise. They had an exercise going on that simulated hijackings, so when they saw these real hijackings, you can imagine the confusion, not knowing whether it's part of the drill, not knowing whether it's a fake hijacking being inserted into their radar. And the tapes bear this out. Again, this confusion enabled the attacks. Okay, there were other drills on 9/11 which have been referenced and reported on, but few, if any, operational details have been made available. One of these is called Vigilant Warrior. This was reported by Richard Clark in his book Against All Enemies. We also have Northern Guardian, which was reported on by the Toronto Star, December 9th of 2001. We don't have much detail about that drill either. And then we have another drill which was not an air defense drill. It was called Tripod 2, and this was a biowarfare exercise scheduled for September 12th of 2001. Now this is very interesting. The effect of this drill was that FEMA was deployed to the New York City area on September 10th of 2001. And according to FEMA spokesman Tom Kenny, he verified this and said that they had been deployed the day before 9/11, just conveniently, and then they were there and sprung into action when the attacks happened. This comes from a Dan Rather interview with Tom Kenny on September 12th of 2001. And interestingly enough, Mr. Kenny made this statement on September 12th in this interview. And when he made this statement, FEMA quickly denied it and said that he had just got his dates mixed up. And that was the official statement for a year or two. And then, interestingly enough, Rudy Giuliani, in his testimony before the 9/11 Commission, verified Mr. Kenny's statement, saying that FEMA had been deployed the day before 9/11. And, of course, this was not followed up on by the 9/11 Commission. And then we have the possible stand-down orders. On May 23rd of 2003, Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta testified before the 9/11 Commission. During his testimony, he stated that he arrived at the Presidential Emergency Operations Center underneath the east wing of the White House at approximately 9:20 a.m. Now, this was during the time when Flight 77 would have been heading towards the Pentagon. Vice President Richard Cheney and other staff were already present in the center, with Mr. Cheney clearly in command. Mineta described a conversation that took place between Mr. Cheney and an unnamed young man regarding orders that had been given before Mineta's arrival.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Was this a stand-down order? If not, why was Flight 77 not intercepted? What were those orders? And despite the fact that this testimony directly contradicted Vice President Cheney's testimony about his location at the time, the 9/11 Commission did not investigate further. So here you have two witnesses. One witness before your commission says Vice President Cheney is at this location at such and such time, and Vice President Cheney himself says he isn't. Now, rather than see this glaring contradiction and follow up on it, the commission actually simply just ignored it, and then they even went so far as to completely omit Norman Mineta's testimony from their final report. But we know that the testimony was given because it was aired live on C-SPAN, and there's tons of video copies out all over the web. You can look that up, just do a Google and you'll find it. There are some other lingering questions about the air defenses, such as why was a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff instruction given in June 2001 requiring the intercept orders be issued by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld personally. This was changed in June of 2001, 2 months before the attack, and this is Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive number 3610, and this is also available on the web. Just look it up. This directive superseded earlier directive dated February 18th of 1997 and, quote, stripped commanders in the field of all authority to act with regard to intercept of hijacked aircraft. So here we have 2 months before 9/11, the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, taking that discretion which military generals had always had to issue shoot-down orders and to make the determination on these intercept protocols, taking that out of the hands of these generals in place and putting it solely in the hands of the Secretary of Defense, 2 months before 9/11. Another lingering question we have to deal with here. Why were the fighter planes that reached Washington 7 minutes after the crash of Flight 93 told by the mission commander, quote, negative clearance to shoot down the aircraft over the nation's capital? And this was reported on in the congressional hearings on the 9/11 Commission report on Friday, July 31st, 2004. And it's also included in some of the NORAD tapes that were released. You can hear them talking about negative clearance to shoot down. So that's another question that needs to be investigated. Now let's look at some of the falsification and contradictions regarding air defenses. Some staff members and commissioners of September 11th panel concluded that the Pentagon's initial story of how it reacted to the 2001 terrorist attacks may have been part of a deliberate effort to mislead the Commission and the public. Suspicion of wrongdoing ran so deep that the 10-member Commission, in a secret meeting at the end of its tenure in the summer of 2004, debated actually referring the matter to the Justice Department for criminal investigation. And this was reported on by the Washington Post, August 2nd of 2006. So this is just coming out now. Thomas H. Keene, who was the head of the 9/11 Commission, said, quote, we to this day don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. It's one of those loose ends that never got tied. Well, Commissioner Keene, former Governor Keene, The fact that that loose end never got tied, whose fault is that? You were head of the commission. It's 2 years later, and now you're just now telling us that you thought the Pentagon was deliberately misleading you, and you did nothing about it? This 9/11 Commission report has absolutely no validity, no integrity, and it's not reliable at all. According to the Commissioner's own statements, this is just ridiculous. Okay, more information of falsification and contradictions. Senator Dayton from Minnesota, he pointed out in congressional hearings on July 31st of 2004 that if the timeline of air defense response as promoted in the 9/11 Commission report is correct, then the timeline presented repeatedly by NORAD during the previous 2 years was completely wrong. Yet now no one at NORAD is willing to comment on their own timeline. Senator Dayton said, quote, "This is just unbelievable negligence. It doesn't matter if we spend $550 billion annually on our national defense if people don't pick up the phone to call one another. And this was not an occasional human or failure. There is nothing but human error and failure to follow established procedures and to use common sense." NORAD's commission's testimony 20 months later covered up those truths. They lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission to create a false impression of competence, communication, coordination, and protection of the American people. Now, Senator Dayton here is correctly identifying these contradictions and what seems to be a ridiculous amount of competence, but I have to disagree a little bit here in his conclusions. First of all, that it was merely incompetence. At what point, when you see such ridiculous failures and such widespread systematic failures, do you begin to suspect maybe it's more than just coincidental incompetence? Okay, I think that's a question we need to ask. And number two, his conclusion that the reason they lied was to create the impression of competence, I have to strongly disagree. Incompetence is exactly the impression they want to purvey. The idea of incompetence only serves the purpose of getting to call for bigger budgets, etc. And it, distracts from the fact that there may be something that went on that was much worse than incompetence, at least at key high-level positions. Okay, now let's move on to the third area of observed facts that the official narrative is in direct conflict with or fails to explain. This would be the creation, foreknowledge, and facilitation of Al-Qaeda. The first thing we need to understand, first question we need to ask and have answered is, what is Al-Qaeda? Shortly before his untimely death, former British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook told the House of Commons that, quote, "Al-Qaeda is not really a terrorist group, but a database of international mujahideen and arms smugglers used by the CIA and Saudis to funnel guerrillas, arms, and money into Soviet-occupied Afghanistan." This was reported by Pierre and Henri Bunel in November 20th, 2005, also in the Wayne Madsen Report and World Affairs Delhi. Okay, let's look at the history of Al-Qaeda, or the database. That's the rough English translation of the word Al-Qaeda. Operation Cyclone of 1986 to 1992. The CIA and MI6, or British intelligence, recruit and train more than 100,000 militants to help fight Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union. In the late 1980s, Pakistan's Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, feeling the Mujahideen network has grown too strong, tells President George H.W. Bush, quote, "You are creating a Frankenstein." However, the warning goes unheeded. Thousands of Mujahideen fighters return to their home countries after the war is over and engage in multiple acts of violence. One Western diplomat notes that these thousands would never have been trained or united without U.S. help and says, quote, "The consequences for all of us are astronomical." This was reported by the Atlantic Monthly in May of 1996. Between 1992 and 1995, the Pentagon used Al-Qaeda and bin Laden to fight against the Serbs in Bosnia. The Pentagon helped bring thousands of Mujahideen and other Islamic militants from Central Asia into Europe to fight alongside the Bosnian Muslims against the Serbs. This is reported on by The Spectator of September of 2003. Bin Laden played a key organizing role in this effort. This was reported by the Los Angeles Times, October 7th of 2001, and as a result, the Balkans became a safe haven and staging area for Islamic terrorism. Also reported on by the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, in November of 2005, and then again in October of 2001. So this is pretty well established fact. Our intelligence agencies, the Pentagon has used Al-Qaeda in several conflicts all over the world when we needed a reason to kind of stir up trouble and then go in, so that we'd have a reason to go in against the Serbs. Okay, more history of Al-Qaeda. The CIA and MI6 were running an Al-Qaeda training camp until as late as 1995. The training at Durunta mainly involved the manufacture and the use of explosives by terrorists. This is from a French DGSE report dated January 9th, 2001. According to this same DGSE report, the Durunta al-Qaeda training camp passed from the control of the CIA to bin Laden in 1995. The classified documents that Bill Clinton's National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, was charged with removing from the National Archives involved an alleged bombing plot by Ahmed Rassem, an al-Qaeda operative who trained at Durunta. What was Sandy Berger covering up by stealing and destroying these documents? You remember that famous incident where he went into the National Security Archives and he reportedly accidentally walked out with some sensitive documents, and he returned most of them, but a few he just unfortunately couldn't find. Well, they had to do with this Al-Qaeda training camp, and I strongly suspect, as do many others, that he was covering up for some direct complicity on the part of the Clinton administration and in facilitating Al-Qaeda. So for those of you who thought I was just going to sit here and rip on Bush and be a Democratic cheerleader, sorry, it goes way deeper. In fact, it goes back, the direct complicity in creating Al-Qaeda goes back all the way to the Carter administration with one of his officials, Zbigniew Brzezinski. All right, so probably a lot of people would say to themselves at this point, so we used Al-Qaeda as intelligence assets. Okay, you know, we used them to fight the Soviets, we used them in Bosnia, but then they turned against us, right? Well, let's look at what Michael Chossudovsky has said. Now, he is an economics professor, and he's a consultant to developing countries. He's part of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Reform, and he's also a researcher and author, an expert on the Yugoslavia wars, and he has written a book called America's War on Terrorism. Let's look at what he has said about this idea that Al-Qaeda turned on the CIA after the CIA created them. He says, a blatant example of media distortion is the so-called blowback thesis. Intelligence assets are said to have gone against their sponsors. What we've created blows back in our face. The blowback thesis is a fabrication. The evidence amply confirms that the CIA never severed its ties to the Islamic militant network. Since the end of the Cold War, these covert intelligence links have not only been maintained, they have become increasingly sophisticated. So what is the ISI? The Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, is the largest and most powerful of the three main branches of the intelligence agencies of Pakistan. During the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s, the CIA enhanced the covert action capabilities of the ISI. A number of officers from the ISI's Covert Action Division received training in the U.S., and many covert action experts of the CIA were attached to the ISI to guide it in its operations against the Soviet troops by using the Afghan Mujahideen, Islamic fundamentalists of Pakistan, and Arab volunteers. The ISI actively collaborates with the CIA. It continues to perform the role of a go-between in numerous intelligence operations on behalf of the CIA. The ISI directly supports and finances a number of terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda. This, again, was reported on by Michael Chossudovsky, Global Research, October of 2001. He was one of the world's foremost experts on this Mujahideen network prior to 9/11, And the day after, literally, he was right out of the gates exposing who is Al Qaeda, who is bin Laden, and their relationship with Western intelligence agencies. He's been there right from day one, and he continues to talk about this. So what is the relationship between Al Qaeda and the ISI? In the mid-1980s, the Pakistani ISI starts a special cell of agents who use profits from heroin production for covert actions, quote, at the insistence of the CIA. All right, and quoting from the Financial Times of August of 2001, they said, quote, this cell promotes the cultivation of opium, the extraction of heroin in Pakistani and Afghan territories under Mujahideen control. After the withdrawal of Soviet troops, the ISI's heroin cell started using this network of refineries and smugglers for smuggling heroin to the Western countries by using the money as a supplement to its legitimate economy. But for these heroin dollars, Pakistan's legitimate economy must have collapsed many years ago. The ISI grows so powerful on this money that, quote, even by the shadowy standards of spy agencies, the ISI is notorious. It is commonly branded as state within a state, or Pakistan's invisible government. And that was reported by Time magazine, May 6 of 2002. So here we have an operational link between the ISI and Al-Qaeda involved in funneling, laundering, and shipping drugs, heroin. Okay, so let's look at the CIA and ISI ties to Al-Qaeda, more of them. Selig Harrison, a longtime regional expert working at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, says, quote, the CIA still has close links with the ISI. Harrison is said to have, quote, extensive contact with the CIA and political leaders in South Asia. He also claims that the U.S. worked with the ISI to create the Taliban. And this was from the Times of India, March 7th of 2001, before 9/11. Operation Diamondback, a sting operation uncovering an attempt to buy weapons illegally for the Taliban, bin Laden, and others, ends with a number of arrests. An Egyptian named Dia Mohsen and a Pakistani named Mohammed Malik are arrested and accused of attempting to buy Stinger missiles, nuclear weapon components, and other sophisticated military weaponry for the Pakistan ISI. This was reported by the South Florida Sun, Sentinel, 8 of 2001, Washington Post, 8 of 2002. Malik appears to have had links to important Pakistani officials, and Mohsen claims a connection to a man, quote, who is very connected to the Taliban and funded by bin Laden. Okay, so there's all sorts of links, all from the ISI to the CIA to Al-Qaeda and all throughout. Here we have some more evidence of operational ties between the CIA, the ISI, and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was treated at an American hospital in Dubai from July 4th to July 14th of 2001. This is just 2 months before the attacks. He was accompanied by his personal physician, also by Ayman al-Zawahiri, and other local dignitaries. During his stay, he was visited by a local CIA official. This CIA operative was called back to CIA's McLean, Virginia headquarters July 15th, so immediately after this visit. This was reported by Elizabeth Bryant, Le Figaro, a French newspaper, and it was also picked up by UPI, United Press International, and reported in July of 2001. So, to summarize all of this, well, it means that Al-Qaeda is nothing more than a network of Mujahideen terrorists, or radicals, that were trained, funded, and utilized over the past 30 years by the CIA, ISI, and Britain's MI6. This funding and cooperation with Al-Qaeda is documented to have continued long after the end of the Afghan-Soviet conflict, and is documented to have continued to as recently as July 2001, 3 months before the 9/11 attacks. In fact, I've got to do a little update on this. I've recently been reading some evidence, again from Professor Chossudovsky, that there's actually solid documentation that the Pentagon used Al-Qaeda Mujahideen operatives as late as August of 2001 and used them in the Macedonian Civil War. So the connections go all the way up to literally a month before the attacks. What does all of this mean? Well, all of this documentation of cooperation between the CIA, Al-Qaeda, and the ISI should directly affect how we interpret the information that we are about to go over in the next few slides. So keep in mind these well-documented connections continuing to as late as within weeks before the attacks. Keep that in mind as we look at these next slides. And these next slides will cover the funding of the September 11th attacks, the active obstruction of investigations into Al-Qaeda operatives prior to September 11th, and the facilitation of the alleged hijackers. Now, the way that the news media has reported this and the way that our public officials have reported this, they would have you believe that this is all just widespread incompetence and, we can't operate, so we've got to have lots more funding and create these big widespread homeland security bureaucracies because our intelligence agencies can't coordinate with each other. That's why it happened. But again, keep in mind all the evidence we just went over of all the documented connections. When you keep that in mind, then you have to begin to question some of this stuff and say, well, maybe this is not just incompetence. Let's look at the financial ties, the financial sources of funding for the hijackers. Shortly before 9/11, the head of the ISI, a man named General Mahmoud Ahmed, wired $100,000 to the lead hijacker Mohammed Atta. This was confirmed by the FBI investigation and Indian intelligence officials tracing the financial ties of the hijackers. This was reported by the Wall Street Journal October 10th of 2001, as well as the Times of India August 15th of 2002. In the week leading up to 9/11, General Ahmed was in the U.S. and met with the Pentagon, National Security Council, CIA Director Tenet, and other unspecified White House officials. On the morning of 9/11, General Ahmed was at a breakfast meeting on Capitol Hill hosted by Senator Bob Graham and Representative Porter Goss, the chairman of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. Now, despite all of this information, the 9/11 Commission report had the audacity to claim, quote, "We have seen no evidence that any foreign government or foreign government official supplied any funding." This is from the 9/11 Commission report on page 172. Well, what more evidence do they need? Now, given what we have already established about ISI's nature as a traditional funding intermediary between the CIA and Mujahideen terrorists, this evidence raises serious questions not only about Pakistan's involvement, but the involvement of the CIA. It certainly deserved to be addressed by the 9/11 Commission. Now let's look at the facilitation of the 9/11 attacks. We have one report here. Were the 9/11 hijackers trained at the Pensacola Naval Air Station? As many as 4 of the 19 suspected hijackers participated during the 1990s in the base's flight training program for foreign military trainees, according to reports in the Washington Post and Newsweek magazine, and also reported by the Pensacola News Journal, September 17th of 2001. The students are instructed in everything from warfare specialty training to air navigation, meteorology, and land-water survival, according to the Pentagon. Local military officials refused to comment on the media reports. They referred calls on the subject to the FBI, which also refused to comment. Then we have more facilitation regarding the visas. We have the head U.S. consular official told to issue visas to Mujahideen terrorists. Michael Springman, head U.S. consular official in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, claims that during the period he is, quote, repeatedly told to issue visas to unqualified applicants. He turns them down, but is repeatedly overruled by superiors. Springman loudly complains to numerous government agencies, but no action is taken. He is fired, and his files on these applications are destroyed. Springman said, quote, "What I was doing was giving visas to terrorists, recruited by the CIA and Osama bin Laden to come back to the United States for training to be used in the war in Afghanistan against the then Soviets. The Jeddah consulate was run by the CIA and staffed almost entirely by intelligence agents. This visa system may have continued at least through 9/11 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers received their visas through this exact embassy in Jeddah, possibly as part of this program. This was reported on by the BBC, November of 2001, July of 2002, and Fox News, July of 2002. Okay, we have more evidence of facilitation of the 9/11 attacks. 2 of the Al-Qaeda hijackers were tracked by the CIA and allowed to enter the U.S. prior to 9/11. In January of 2000, the CIA tracked 2 of the alleged hijackers of Flight 77 to a secret Al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia, then looked on as they re-entered America. Al-Hazmi and Al-Mahidar then lived openly in the United States, using their real names, obtaining driver's licenses, opening bank accounts, and enrolling in flight schools until the morning of September 11th. This was reported by Newsweek. Let's move on to some more facilitation of the September 11th attacks. Here we have a case of White House obstruction of the bin Laden investigation. In July 2001, FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill says, quote, "The main obstacles to investigate Islamic terrorism were U.S. oil corporate interests and the role played by Saudi Arabia in it." End quote. He adds, quote, "All the answers, everything needed to dismantle Osama bin Laden's organization can be found in Saudi Arabia." End quote. On August 22, 2001, John O'Neill resigned from the FBI because of repeated obstruction of his investigations into Al-Qaeda. This is reported by the New Yorker, January 14th of 2002. On August 23, 2001, O'Neill began his new job as head of the security for the World Trade Center and was later killed in the 9/11 attacks. O'Neill speculated about the reasons for which his investigations were obstructed. However, hindsight and evidence that has come to light give us a better perspective on this obstruction. Could the CIA and White House have been protecting their operatives? Okay, so let's move on to motive, disposition, and opportunism before and after September 11th. Now, the information we have seen to this point destroys the official theory and its explanations, or lack thereof, based on coincidence and incompetence. Since it is impossible to explain the events of 9/11 without relying on a conspiracy theory of some sort, we must now ask ourselves 3 questions. What sort of conspiracy was capable of causing these attacks, given the preceding information? 2. Who had the motive and disposition to do so? 3. Who has obstructed efforts to investigate 9/11? Well, let's first look at disposition. History shows indisputably that both governments in general, as well as the United States government specifically, have engaged in false flag attacks for war provocation or to shape public sentiment. Now, a false flag is a term that comes from naval warfare, and it means an attack where you would fly a false flag, of an opposing army or faction. In other words, it's an attack that is intended to appear that it is being launched by another party than the one that is actually conducting the attack. Say I'm a German naval warship and I want to attack an American warship, but I want them to think that they're being attacked by a British warship. So I would go ahead and fly the British flag up my flagpole, and that's the origin of the term false flag. Now let's look at some historical evidence, some pretty well documented and well agreed upon incidents of these sort of false flag attacks and war provocations in history. And we're just going to mostly look at recent history here. We could go back a lot further if we wanted. We could look at things like Nero burning down Rome and blaming it on the Christians, things like that. But these are all from pretty recent American history. First of all, we have the sinking of the battleship Maine, and this was used as the initiating act to draw the United States into the Spanish-American War. We have the sinking of the Lusitania, which drew the United States into World War I, and which is now pretty well understood to have been, at the very least, intentionally provoked by the United States. We have the Reichstag fire incident, and this enabled Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Shortly after his initial election, he was looking for a reason to consolidate power and pass legislation, which he later was able to, and he accomplished this by having Hermann Göring set fire to the German Reichstag, or Parliament building, and the resulting national fervor and fear enabled him to pass the Enabling Act, which he would not have otherwise been able to. We also have the Pearl Harbor attacks, which is now documented to have been well known to the Roosevelt administration, and in fact it appears that naval forces may have been intentionally sent to Pearl Harbor in order to increase the magnitude of those attacks. And this was done because the American public at the time did not support the idea of involvement in World War II. In fact, Roosevelt campaigned for election by promising to keep America out of World War II. Americans were very much opposed to getting involved in yet another bloody European war, and they didn't see any national interest in doing so. So the Pearl Harbor attacks, as any historian would admit, provided the wave of public sentiment needed for America to enter the war. And now we do have solid documentation that it was known ahead of time. And if you want to do more research on that, there's plenty of it available on the web. One really good book on the subject is called Day of Deceit, and I cannot remember the author's name, but that is the title of the book. We also have Operation Ajax, which was a CIA operation which staged terrorism in Iran with the intent of overthrowing the president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a very pro-Western, westernized, anti-communist leader of Iran. He was very moderate. But the problem with Mossadegh was that he refused to give British Petroleum an absolute monopoly over Iran's oil. He started to have these crazy ideas of Iran being sovereign and independent and strong and have a vibrant, independent economy. And as a result, the CIA used false flag acts of terrorism that were then blamed on Mossadegh in order to have him imprisoned. And then, of course, we have Operation Gladio, and this is documented by Daniel Ganser in his book NATO's Secret Armies. But these were NATO operations in Europe that were false flag acts of terrorism against civilians, and they were designed to sway public sentiment in several European countries, including Italy, by blaming these attacks on leftists and communists. We have Operation Northwoods from 1962. Now this was an operational plan devised by the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Kennedy administration. It was signed off on by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including Lionel Lemnitzer, who actually signed the document. And this plan was green-lighted and it was set to go operational. Fortunately, Kennedy himself put the brakes on and then, as a result, fired Lemnitzer. But what this plan was a systematic campaign of false flag terrorist attacks, and the purpose, as openly stated in these documents, and these are now declassified and available all over the web, ABC reported on them, and the purpose of these false flag acts of terrorism was to provide a, quote, helpful wave of public indignation, end quote, and therefore justify an attack on Cuba. And some of the things that they planned to do were to crash airliners, blow up airliners, attack U.S. military bases. I mean, there's a whole gamut of different false flag attacks that they planned to use to blame on Cuba so that we could justify invasion. In addition, we have the use of Al-Qaeda Mujahideen network to create crisis and pretexts for intervention throughout the Middle East and the Balkans. So anyway, that is just some of the evidence for the disposition towards false flag terrorism on the part of the United States government that is very well documented. Let's look at some more evidence of disposition. Let's try and pin this down to specific agencies if we can. Let's look at this quote here from a man named Vern Lyon, who is a former CIA operative and who went public in the documentary Secrets of the CIA. He said, quote, "The CIA is a state-sponsored terrorist association. They don't look at people as human beings. They are nothing but pieces on a chessboard." Okay, so here we have it from a former CIA employee operative, and he comes right out and says it. The CIA is a state-sponsored terrorist association. Let's move on to motive here, now that we've discussed disposition. Now, there's an old saying that comes from Roman law, qui bono, which means who benefits. Anytime you're looking at a crime, it's, at the very least, it's helpful to look, it's not always a sign of guilt, but at the very least, it's useful and helpful to look at who benefits from an event or a crime. Well, we have this organization called the Project for a New American Century. Now, they're not a shadowy organization at all. They're very open and public. In fact, they have a website. It's located at www.newamericancentury.org. And this is a foreign policy think tank. It was founded in 1997, and its open stated goal is to promote American global leadership and military dominance. Among this project's members are many current and former Bush administration officials and other key figures. And some of the prominent names are Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, now head of the World Bank, Scooter Libby, Jeb Bush, William Kristol, Elliott Abrams, and more. So how does this relate to motive? Well, let's look. In September of 2000, the Project for the New American Century published a report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This report calls for America to assume its role as the world's lone superpower and calls for a transformation of America's military into a dominant worldwide force. On page 51, this report states, quote, "The process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor." So here we have this foreign policy think tank that has as members many current and former George W. Bush administration officials, publishing a report almost exactly a year before September 11th. And what do they say? Well, we want to make all these changes. We want America to be the dominant military in the world, but that's a transformation that's probably going to take a long time unless we have some sort of catalyzing catastrophic event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, a year later, they got it. Remember from the most initial news reports, almost from within an hour of the attacks, the media was all parroting one talking point about it, and that was that this is a new Pearl Harbor. Also, the Foreign Affairs Journal, that is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, they were talking about how you could have some sort of new Pearl Harbor. The fact that we see that talking point, and if you want to do something really interesting, just go to the Internet Archive, type in a Google search for Internet Archive or Wayback Machine, and this is a website that has saved web pages going back about 7-8 years. So if you go back to the New York Times or the BBC web page from the day of September 11th, and you can see these headlines, and all of these publications have the same terminology. It says a new Pearl Harbor. Well, I don't think that's a coincidence that we had PNAC using that same terminology a year before, talking about how it would help them accomplish their purposes, and then a year later when the attacks happen, that is the media talking point throughout the whole media. Personally, I just can't accept that as being a coincidence. Let's look at some more possible motives for the September 11th attacks, motives and benefits. And let's look at some of those possible motives by advocates of globalization. In their 2005 report, Building a North American Community, the Council on Foreign Relations calls for a common currency for North America and common security border between the USA, Canada, and Mexico. They're talking about literally shifting the borders from where they are now, the borders between Canada and Mexico, and having a common security border. This was published in 2005 at roughly the same time when the Security and Prosperity Partnership Agreement was signed by President Bush, Vicente Fox, and the Prime Minister of Canada. Now, this 2005 report invokes the events of September 11th at least 8 separate times in justification for these steps towards political globalization, which would undermine U.S. national sovereignty and the rule of constitutional law. And the reason it would undermine constitutional law is because, well, we're creating a North American Union here, and it's not being done by bringing in new territories, which is what used to happen in the past with new states and as the United States expanded. It's being done by signing these administrative agreements, and it's circumventing the constitutional processes of government. And one of the stated goals in this report is actually to expand the jurisdiction of the NAFTA courts that were set up so that they have even greater jurisdiction and effectiveness in the United States, or in what will be the North American Union. So anyway, the fact that this report that calls for this, that was published in 2005, it invokes the September 11th attacks so many times as the justification, means that here we have a potential motive by a very powerful organization. Let's look at some more motive on the part of advocates of globalization in their own words. Now, on September 12th, 2001, former Senator and Council on Foreign Relations member Gary Hart, on the day after the 9/11 attacks, was on C-SPAN, and he said, quote, "There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father talked about, and that is a new world order." Okay, so rather than joining us all in mourning, what is the CFR doing? They're being opportunistic. They're looking at this, at the very least, they're looking at this in a time when the rest of the country was in mourning, and they're saying, how can we use this to create a new world order? That alone turns my stomach a little bit, but I also look at it and I have to say, well, here's another clear motive. Let's look at some more potential motive on the part of advocates of globalization. Here we have a statement by Henry Kissinger. This statement was made on May 21st of 1992 at what is called the Bilderberg meeting. Now, the Bilderberg meeting is something that until very recently was denied to have ever existed. But now it has become so reported on and so documented, it is now admitted to exist. And Henry Kissinger was at this meeting in 1992, which is basically a gathering of world financiers, policymakers, government officials, and that happens every year under very secretive circumstances and very tight security. Henry Kissinger, at this meeting in 1992, he said, quote, "Today Americans would be outraged if UN troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow they will be grateful. This is especially true if they were told there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated, that threatened our very existence. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being granted to them by their world government." Now, what is the significance of this statement? Well, if it was just said by some joker on the street, it wouldn't be very significant at all. But when you consider the sway that Dr. Kissinger holds with the current administration, we have Bob Woodward's book, which came out recently, called State of Denial, where he lays out his assertion that Dr. Kissinger is actually the policy architect behind the war in Iraq. And now, whether that is completely true or not, I have no reason to disbelieve Mr. Woodward. But whether that is completely true or not, we do know that he is an insider in the George W. Bush administration, and he is very, very much somebody who is looked to in formulating policies. And given that established fact, a statement like this, it troubles me very much. And again, it is more evidence of potential motive. Okay, now let's look at some of the circumstances that came into play after the attacks. And I call this section propping up the official myth. Now, if you remember, the Bush administration resisted a formal investigation into the 9/11 attacks, but eventually relented under pressure from the victims' families. The director of research for the 9/11 Commission was a Bush administration insider named Philip Zelikow, who was later revealed to have also been the primary author of the Bush preemptive war doctrine. Okay, so this is the guy who wrote the preemptive war doctrine, the idea that we have the duty to go out and take on gathering threats, nations that may not yet pose a significant threat or a clear and present danger, but nations that had the potential to pose a threat later on. And that was a significant shift in foreign policy. It's a shift from the established conventions of war that nations had been, responsible nations had been operating on for a long time. And this guy wrote it. So there can be no doubt that he is an administration insider, and he was appointed to be the director of all the research for the commission. So he controlled basically what information was researched and what was not. Now, Professor Zelikow's area of academic expertise, and this is very interesting, rather than being qualified in criminal investigations, Professor Zelikow's area of academic expertise is, in his own words, the creation and maintenance of public myths or public presumptions. In his academic work and elsewhere, he has taken a special interest in what he has called, quote, searing or molding events that take on transcendent importance. This is from his own biography page on Wikipedia. In the November-December 1998 issue of Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, yes, he also is a member, he co-authored an article entitled Catastrophic Terrorism. This is 3 years before the attacks, almost. In this article, Professor Zelikow speculated that if the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center had succeeded, quote, such an act of catastrophic terrorism would be a watershed event in American history. It could undermine America's fundamental sense of security. Like Pearl Harbor, the event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures, scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and the use of deadly force. So here we have that same terminology again, a new Pearl Harbor. What is going on here? So what does all of this mean? Well, it means, at the very least, that organizations and individuals of significant influence in the Bush administration stood to benefit from the 9/11 attacks. Those stated benefits have been realized in the wake of 9/11. It also means that after caving to pressure from the victims' families, the Bush administration conceded to an investigation and then placed in a position of key influence as director of all research an insider. And it means that this administration insider, rather than being an expert in criminal investigation, was quite possibly and likely the most qualified individual in the world at the time to fashion a reorienting national myth around the events of 9/11 that would serve as a foundational transcendent event for the war on terror and the new American empire. Okay? None of that is disputable, and I will leave you to draw your own conclusions based on it. As you can see, there's a lot of dots, and the lines between them don't have to go very far. I think we're starting to get a picture of what is going on. Okay, so what can be done about this? Well, much has been done, and many Americans are becoming aware of this information. You are not alone, and this is not a fringe minority of Americans. According to an October 14th New York Times CBS News poll, 81% of Americans distrust the official account of 9/11, with 53% saying that the administration is, quote, hiding something, and 28% saying that they are, quote, mostly lying. Only 16% of respondents said that they believe the Bush administration is, quote, telling the truth about 9/11 and their foreknowledge. Why has this happened? This dramatic shift in public opinion has happened despite a complete refusal by the mainstream media to address the problems with the 9/11 Commission report and alternative explanations seriously. This shift has happened due to grassroots efforts of people who have become aware of this and become active in spreading the truth. So, in summary, let me give you my recommendation as to how we ought to deal with this problem we're facing. First, we must accept responsibility for our mistake as American citizens. Instead of reacting with historical perspective and vigorously investigating all of the relevant facts, we have failed our posterity and allowed our reason and judgment to be corrupted by a horrific event. We looked for, accepted, and acted upon answers that were given to us while the shock and awe psychological effect was still fresh, and long before such claims could possibly have been validated. We gave in to fear. Our public officials were so ready with their answers and solutions, encouraging us to act on these irrational impulses. Irrational because they are based, as admitted, on no hard evidence or empirical process to which the American public was given access. For this, history may never forgive us. 5 years after this tragic event, we must acknowledge that it is the seminal foundational event which has justified the hostility to and erosion of our constitutional republic and the principles which it embodies. We need to act immediately to reverse this course and heal the open infected wound upon our nation, that is, the September 11th attacks. A wound which does not heal because of the actions and rhetoric of those whose agenda and aspirations constantly benefit from its reopening. Unless we act now to heal this wound through a relentless pursuit of truth, a commitment to bring to justice those truly responsible, and most importantly, a complete rejection of fear as a basis for political action, we will have to face our children and grandchildren and admit that we failed them as the trustees of their liberty and prosperity, which the Constitution was designed to secure to them. Some things that we can all do. While we can speak to our friends, our families, our neighbors, and even complete strangers, it is worth leaving our comfort zone to save our constitutional republic. Burn and or distribute activist DVDs of September 11th documentaries or send video links to your email list. DVD copies are available for free in the Salt Lake area if you want to get a hold of me. Links for the following powerful documentaries can be found easily by searching www.video.google.com and entering the following search terms: Terror Storm, Loose Change, 9/11 Mysteries, Improbable Collapse, Steve Jones, and others. There is a growing number of candidates from all over the political spectrum who support a new investigation into September 11th. Support these candidates in local and national races. Vote for and promote candidates who support the Constitution, government accountability, and the rule of law, regardless of their party. Write letters to the editor of your local newspaper exposing the truth and in support of a new 9/11 investigation. Send links to relevant research news articles and videos to your whole email list. And the most important thing that we can all do is rise above the fear. Thanks for listening to this presentation.
Nothing is left but steel and fire, and the blood boiling in my veins. I look to the sky and close my eyes.